Hello, I'm Zeev Witties. This is Story Structure Lessons from the Discworld, and we are in part 4, the last part in this series. And this part is all about taking mice with you, taking the ideas and the concepts that we've learned and using them yourself, applying them practically in your own writing and in your own reading. I'm going to talk about how to use this mice tool on your own stories, how to analyze your own stories like we've been analyzing other pieces. I'm going to be talking about when to use mice. I'm going to be talking about points in the writing process that you might find mice helpful, and other opportunities that you might not have considered where mice can be a fantastic tool. Lastly, as a kind of summary, I'm going to talk about why. I'm going to be highlighting some of the underlying principles of why mice works so well and why it's such a good answer to the structure questions that we started this series off with. Let's talk about the how, about how to find the mice elements in your story. You've watched these videos, you've learned about mice. If you're a writer, you probably have a story or a draft or an idea, and all of this good stuff and strong structure that we've been talking about, you want it in your story. You want to work out mice for your own work. It could be that you've got a story, but you're finding it tough to work with. It's not doing quite what you want it to do. It's staying away from the points where you wanted to reach. It doesn't feel like it's going quite right. Maybe what you need from mice is to kind of pick it apart, untangle it into the individual threads and arcs where it gets much easier to grasp. It could also be that you don't have any idea what your focus actually is, and that when I ask questions like, what is important in your story, or what should the reader care about, you're not actually sure what to answer. Doesn't mean your story isn't interesting or compelling, but you don't know how to answer those specific questions. Since this particular video is very writer-oriented, I'm going to give a quick reminder. There are no rules to writing. Everything that I say, you will find lots of exceptions to. There are other structures that work in different ways than what I'm describing. And a particular point, structure is one element in a story. It's not the only one. A lot of times, you're going to compromise and say, okay, this structure will not be great in this particular story. That doesn't mean it's a bad story. It just means that structure is maybe not its strong point, and that's fine. So, let's talk about finding your mouse in your story. We've seen how to analyze an existing story using mice, but trying to do the same thing with your own work is something very different. Your work is a work in progress. The arcs aren't done yet, and they're certainly not set in stone. We've seen how to look at an existing story and tell what arcs are there, but how do we look at a story and tell what arcs we want? As usual, I'm not going to tell you what to write, but I'm going to offer suggestions for how you might decide. So, one way to use mice that is fantastic for just getting unblocked and starting to move is using mice as a kind of sorting hat, because mice gives you 4 bins or drawers. Every story, hypothetically, needs to fit into milieu, idea, character, event. One of the 4. And just saying, well, which of these is it? I should squeeze it into one of them. Which one? It feels to me more like a thing, more like an event, more like a character. It doesn't need to be precise. It doesn't need to be full. It doesn't need to capture every detail. You might have multiple arcs of different mice elements. All of those are fine, but just asking the question to begin with, thinking about your story or an arc in your story, and answering the most basic categorization questions already gets you thinking, gets your wheels turning, gets you at least being more precise about what the nature of your story is than it was to begin with. So that's a great way to get unblocked and to start figuring out where your story lies and what you want its focus to be. Another thing that works really nicely is working backwards. We usually think of story arcs as moving forwards. You start by establishing the arc, and then it moves forward, and eventually it resolves. and that's great. That's how we read the story. But this goes back to the idea of consistency that we've talked about. We want our arcs to be consistent, to feel like they're on the same point from start to finish. And here is where that works in your favor. Let's say that you have a really strong ending. If you have a really strong ending, if you know where you want the story to go and to be headed, well, then you can work back from there. You know how it resolves, and therefore you can figure out what the focus is for the resolution. What kind of a resolution is it? Is it an event resolution or a character resolution? And figure out everything about that point in the story that you are absolutely sure about, and then you can work backwards from that point to the beginning and figure out how to set it up. What this means is that if you're sure about any point in your story, if you're like, this is the part that I really like, that part can be your guiding light to how the entire rest of the story, or at least the rest of that particular arc, can look, because it guides you and shows you what it is that you need to be consistent about. What kind of arc is the right kind to contain that one point that you're very happy with? Maybe the most crucial way to find your mice structures is just to ask yourself, what do I love in my story? What do I care about? Why have I chosen to write this specific thing? When you put your finger on what you care about, why you're excited, that is almost always the answer to what will the reader find here? What should the reader care about? And this is a lot of mice's strength and its flexibility. Mice never tells you what to write, what's important, where your focus should be. It asks you what you want to write, what you think is important, where your focus already is. And when you are able to find that, to be specific about it, to articulate it, then you can home in on that thing that you love and that you want other people to care about, and make that thing shine. So let's talk about when to use mice, about the many moments and milestones at which you can say, you know what, I'm going to take mice out of the toolbox and start drawing myself some story arcs. One obvious point is at the beginning, when you are outlining, if you are outlining. Some writers are very fond of planning their stories out in advance, of considering and plotting the whole thing from the start. If this is your approach, then you might find a lot of benefit to considering right from the start what your major story arcs are going to be, what people are going to care about, and imagine at least your biggest and most important story arcs from the start as part of your outline. Now, this is very individual. Different people write differently. If you find yourself connecting strongly to this idea of mice and story arcs, and it fits for you in your idea of how you come up with a story and plan out a story, this approach can be very helpful, and it will probably pay off very nicely in giving you a very strong structure from the start. On the other hand, if you connect less to that approach, that's fine. This is a process thing, and it's very individual. On the other hand, this I think is a little more universal. When you are in revisions, very often when you have finished your first draft, you have managed to create a wonderful, big, hard lump of story material. It is not finished yet. It has a lot of work left to go, and that work is finessing it, smoothing it out, working out the details, putting it in not just the rough shape that you want it to be, but the actual final impressive shape where everything works and looks wonderful. This is where mice is a fantastic help, because when you are at that point, when you've finished a draft, that's when you can look back on it and analyze it, just like we have been analyzing pieces all through this series. And you can see what arcs it has. You can see, okay, I see it has this arc and this arc and this arc. I can see that there's an arc here that isn't working so well, or that I've forgotten about it, or trailed off, or it didn't start out, it didn't build up properly. Got a lot of options here. You can use mice in order to look back on your own work, Map out what arcs there are, compare it to what arcs you want, and fix your story, refine it, tweak it accordingly in order to get the buildup that you want, the effects you want, and finally the structure that you want that matches your story the best. Very, very similarly, a lot of times in the middle of writing, we feel lost. We feel like we have gone astray. The story isn't working. We don't know what happens next. We are no longer interested in it. It doesn't seem to have gone the way that we expected it to. In this situation, using mice and looking at your story arcs can be a kind of map. It lets you look in a very concrete and practical and helpful way at where you are, what story arcs you already have and have built up. You can even have a few maps, one of which is maybe what you were planning to begin with. Other things can be what you've actually gotten so far, which might be entirely different than what you were originally expecting, or some other ideas that you're excited about and that have kind of sprung up and developed through your writing so far, but you didn't see how they worked in what you have so far. You can use mice as a kind of shorthand for yourself to talk about all the different shapes that your story can take. And using mice, you can compare those and see which one you like, which focus speaks to you, which feels achievable, which feels strong and solid. This gives you just a very practical way to consider different options of what your story might be. And that is often a great way to get unstuck and unlost. So let's give a few other examples and opportunities of where you can use mice, not even necessarily as a writer. For one thing, there is writing that doesn't feel like writing. For example, maybe you are giving a presentation in your workplace. Maybe you're writing a thread on Twitter or a Facebook post or an email that you really want people to read all the way to the end. All of these things need some structure. You need to grab people's attention from the start. You need people to read it through feeling that it is developing and giving them what it is that they want to be receiving. It needs to not lose their attention, not get distracted and go off to the side on all kinds of tangents. All of the principles of mice and story arc, including how do you get their attention to begin with, apply to this kind of writing as well. And thinking about these kinds of considerations about what people are interested in and how you structure whatever it is that you're saying as something interesting that is adequately and satisfyingly developed through the course of whatever it is that you're doing, that can be a real help and get you to communicate a lot more effectively. Another place where mice is pretty fantastic is in reading. And it starts out by recognizing more. I think all of us, when we come to books and stories and movies and TV shows, we have stuff we like. We have stuff that we are looking for in these stories. But not every story gives them to us. A lot of stories are not the stories that we want to read. They're just a story doing something else, doing its own thing. And we may or may not know how to recognize and enjoy that particular thing. So when you read, I don't know, maybe a very popular book that you do not get along with at all, or something that you're finding absolutely bewildering, you can start using mice and structural tools to just look at, hey, wait a second. Maybe this isn't working for me. Maybe it's confusing to me, but let's see. Where is it spending its time? What promises is it making? What is it building up? And working that way, you can let the text itself tell you how to read it, what is important to it, what it is trying to achieve. And you begin to recognize a much broader range of different kinds of fiction and different kinds of focus that a story might have. Instead of being annoyed at a mystery because it doesn't have enough, because it's not mysterious enough, you might notice, oh, I see. What it actually cares about is the setting where all this is taking place. And similarly, you're going to encounter other stories that are doing things that you weren't expecting at all. And when you start looking for where it is trying to focus your attention, you will recognize a much broader range of focuses. Once you recognize these, you can begin to appreciate them. And then the range of fiction and story that you enjoy grows much wider. You're no longer limited to the taste that you started out with, the particular things that you're looking for again and again and again. Instead, you can look at a wide range of stories and let each one of them show you the path to what they are trying to tell you. Another place where it can be really helpful to be able to analyze stories and meet them on their own terms is in critique and review. A reviewer who can really tell what a story is trying to do, take it apart, see what its threads are, see how it works, and then say how well it has managed to do that thing, that can give really helpful, insightful, excellent reviews. And one more use that you might not have expected, but I think is likely to click with you, is query letters. What is a query letter or a synopsis or an elevator pitch, but the ability to take a complicated, rich, compelling story and distill it down to the basic, the explanation of what is it that should be really interesting and exciting about this story. When you're able to do that, you're able to say, this is the interesting piece of this story. This is why you should read it. And that can make your query letters and in general your summaries a lot better and hit home much more easily. As a kind of summary, I'm going to give a few words on why mice. We began this series asking what structure is, how we can tell whether we've got a good one, and how to talk about a multitude of structures, not just one or two. Why is mice such a good answer to this? I'm going to highlight two important angles of what makes mice work. Not any of the individual elements, but instead what it is that mice encourages you to do and to think about. The first angle is specificity. And if I had to sum up mice in one line, it would be this: be specific in what the story cares about. Let's take a very basic example. Somebody has been murdered and a diamond has been stolen. Okay, let's be specific about what it is that's important to the story. We've done this. We've had examples of this. Maybe we care about the sense of puzzlement. How could this have happened? This is very mysterious. Maybe it's about the sense of loss. Oh no, this person has died. Oh no, this diamond has been stolen. Maybe it's about the sense of fear. Oh no, there is a murderer on the loose. Maybe I too will be murdered. You don't need the M, I, C, and E in order to break apart different options for what it is that we might care about. You can figure those out yourself. But my point here is not only that you can figure them out yourself, but also that you can always drill down and be more specific. Let's say that we say that what is important in this story is puzzlement. In mice, we would say that this is an idea story. We want the answer to a question. Okay, what question? You have to be specific because you have a lot of options. Maybe the question is, why would somebody do this? That would be one kind of story. Maybe the question is, how was this possible? And it's a question of logistics and timetables and clever tricks. Maybe the important question is, which one of these suspects was it? And that's where our attention is. Or maybe the question is, hey, some other really weird thing went on. Let's investigate that. Each of these would be a fine idea arc. But we need to be specific about which one it is. And that's not only for mysteries where we have lots of questions naturally. We can do this for any situation. We can take a situation and be more specific. Let's say that we have a one-sided crush. It might be a romance story. It might be, we could say that this in mice would be a character arc. Okay, so what is the character arc? It's not just, okay, this character is suffering and is going to need to develop in some vague, undefined way. No, they need to develop in a specific and well-defined way. Maybe what they need to develop is they need to develop their confidence and their self-worth. And that is what is going to develop their character. Maybe they need to grow past real personal flaws. The other side is legitimately and sympathetically uninterested, and the protagonist is going to need to grow and get better in order to resolve their situation. Maybe the character arc is the Crush's. The Crush needs to learn appreciation for the protagonist, and we want to see that happening. Maybe it's a question of, is this even the right relationship for the protagonist? Each of these is a very different way for a character arc to take place. Each one of them is a very different development for the same character to go through. So Mice is pointing us to be specific about what it is that the reader is supposed to care about. Mice is kind of saying, listen, there are a million stories that superficially from a distance look kind of like yours. They have the same general plot. They have the same general elements. That doesn't mean your story isn't unique. The more you realize what it is that makes your story itself, the better you'll be able to bring it out, the more distinct and well-defined and well-structured it will be. The other angle I want to talk about is promise and payoff, because that's a lot of what we've said. We've said we always want to know what it is that we are working towards, and we want to actually get that thing that we are working towards. In the last video, for each one of the elements, we said that there is a kind of typical arc. The way that that particular kind of arc usually looks, the elements we expect to encounter in order to pose and then satisfy the reader's interest in milieu or idea or character or event. But again, we don't need to be constrained to those 4 rough categories. Your idea might not fit into any one of those 4, and more to the point, it's likely to be a lot more specific. It's going to be your very specific arc. So your promise goes here. You're going to build a promise and payoff arc just like the ones that we've seen, but it's going to be yours. And that's what your story and your arc are going to be. So what does Mice direct us towards? It asks, what should we care about specifically? And then to follow through on that. That's it. That's what Mice is. That's easy to say. Just like it's easy to say that story construction is kind of sort of like planning actual buildings. But in this series, we have gone into details and examples. We built up tools and terminologies. So I hope now this is easy to say, but it's also something that you can go out and actually do. That is all. Thank you for sticking with me through these videos. I hope you've gotten a lot out of them. This is the last video in this series, but I would love to make more videos to answer questions, do more analyses of books and movies, and go into deeper topics that I didn't have time for here. So if you have a question or a comment or request, anything that you'd like to hear from me, please leave me a comment. You will find me at zeevoities.com. On Twitter, I am quite vague. Thank you, and see you next time.